12,000 feet above the Pacific Ocean. June 4, 1942. Every system in the cockpit was screaming at him to pull up. Every protocol demanded he abort. Every instinct told him this was suicide. But Lieutenant Commander Wade McClusky wasn't listening to any of them. He pushed the stick forward, and his SBD Dauntless dove straight down toward the Japanese carrier fleet below. What happened in the next 4 minutes would change the outcome of World War II. And it all started with one man's refusal to accept. Impossible. The altimeter was spinning backward. The dive angle indicator showed 70 degrees, far steeper than regulation allowed. His wingmen were pulling out, following protocol, climbing back to safety. But McClusky kept diving. Faster. Steeper. Breaking every rule in the Navy's dive-bombing manual. The ocean was rushing up to meet him at 240 miles per hour. In his headset, frantic voices were yelling for him to abort. But he had seen something no one else had. And if he was right, this insane dive would win the battle. If he was wrong, he would be dead in approximately 180 seconds. This wasn't supposed to be how the Battle of Midway ended. But history had other plans. If stories like this fascinate you, hit subscribe, because the most unbelievable part of this one is still ahead. 6 months earlier, Wade McClusky wasn't thinking about changing history. He was thinking about staying alive. Pearl Harbor had been attacked 3 weeks ago, and every American pilot in the Pacific knew what that meant. Japan was winning. Fast. Their carrier fleet was unstoppable. Their pilots were better trained. Their aircraft were superior. And their strategy had worked flawlessly, until it hadn't. McClusky was 38 years old. That made him ancient by fighter pilot standards. Most of the hotshot aviators were in their early 20s, fresh out of flight school, cocky and reckless. McClusky was either. He was methodical. Precise. A test pilot before the war, he had spent years pushing aircraft to their limits, not to show off, but to understand exactly where those limits were. He knew what planes could do. More importantly, he knew what they couldn't do. Or at least, what everyone thought they couldn't do. By May 1942, American intelligence had intercepted Japanese communications. Admiral Yamamoto was planning something big. The target, Midway Atoll, a tiny speck of coral in the middle of nowhere that happened to be strategically critical. If Japan took Midway, they could launch attacks on Hawaii. If America lost Midway, the war in the Pacific was essentially over. The U.S. Navy threw everything they had at the defense. 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. Every available pilot. Every bomber. Every torpedo plane. It wasn't enough. On paper, Japan still had the advantage. Their 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were larger, faster, and carried more aircraft. American strategists knew this would be close. What they didn't know was that the entire battle would come down to one 4-minute window. And one pilot's willingness to ignore everything he'd been taught. June 4th started badly. American torpedo bombers launched their attacks at dawn. It was a massacre. Out of 41 Devastator torpedo bombers that attacked the Japanese fleet, only 6 returned. The Japanese carriers were untouched. Their Zeros were shredding the American attack formations. Pilots were dying by the dozen. Radio chatter was chaos, screaming, explosions, desperate calls for backup that never came. Wade McClusky was listening to all of it from 20,000 feet, circling with his squadron of SBD Dauntless dive bombers, waiting for orders. The problem was simple: nobody knew where the Japanese carriers were. The coordinates American intelligence had provided were wrong. The torpedo bombers had found the fleet by accident, and paid for it with their lives. Now McClusky's squadron was running low on fuel, circling empty ocean, with no target in sight. His radio crackled. The order came through. Return to base. Mission aborted. McClusky stared at his fuel gauge. He had maybe 30 minutes of flight time left. Enough to make it back to the Enterprise. Barely. His wingmen were already turning around. But something felt wrong. The Japanese carriers had to be close. The torpedo bombers had found them. They couldn't have just vanished. He made a decision that would have gotten him court-martialed if it failed. He ignored the order. He kept flying. What no one realized was that McClusky had just made the most important decision of the entire Pacific War. For 15 minutes he flew on instinct. Scanning the ocean. Burning fuel he couldn't afford to waste. His squadron was confused. Why weren't they turning back? Some pilots broke formation and headed home. McClusky didn't blame them. But he kept going. And then he saw it. A single Japanese destroyer, moving fast, cutting a white wake through the blue water. It was heading northwest. McClusky's brain processed the implications in seconds. Japanese destroyers didn't operate alone. They escorted carriers. Which meant if he followed that wake, he'd find the fleet. He banked hard and followed. 2 minutes later, the horizon changed. 4 massive shapes appeared through the morning haze. The Japanese carrier fleet. All 4 of them. Lined up in a perfect row. And they were completely defenseless. Their fighters were at low altitude, slaughtering the American torpedo bombers. Their decks were full of aircraft being refueled and rearmed. They weren't expecting an attack from above. McClusky's pulse didn't even spike. He'd been a test pilot too long to get excited. He simply keyed his radio and said, "I have the target. All units, prepare for attack run." The Japanese carriers were moving at 25 knots. That meant McClusky had to calculate wind speed, target movement, dive angle, and release point, all while dropping at terminal velocity. Standard Navy doctrine said the optimal dive angle was 60 degrees. Steep enough to be accurate. Shallow enough to pull out safely. McClusky looked at the carriers below. They were huge targets. But they were also surrounded by destroyers and cruisers throwing up walls of anti-aircraft fire. A 60-degree dive meant more time in the kill zone. More time for AA gunners to track him. More time to die. So he changed the plan. He increased the dive angle. 70 degrees. Then 75. His wingmen saw what he was doing and hesitated. This wasn't protocol. This was insane. At that angle, the aircraft might not pull out. The G-forces could rip the wings off. Pilots had died testing those limits. But McClusky had tested those limits. And he knew something the manual didn't account for: fear. A steeper dive meant less time for the enemy to shoot at you. It also meant less time for your own fear to take over. You committed. You dove. You released. You pulled out, or you didn't. There was no middle ground. He rolled inverted and pushed the stick forward. The Dauntless dropped like a stone. His airspeed indicator redlined. The wings started shaking. In the back seat, his radio man was gripping his harness so hard his knuckles went white. Below them, Japanese sailors were pointing at the sky, scrambling, realizing too late what was happening. McClusky's entire field of vision was the deck of the Akagi, Japan's flagship carrier. He could see individual crew members running. He could see aircraft lined up wingtip to wingtip. He could see fuel hoses, bombs, torpedoes. Everything needed to sustain a naval air war, all sitting exposed on one wooden deck. At 2,500 feet, he released. A single 1,000-pound bomb dropped away, wobbling slightly in the turbulence, then stabilizing. McClusky yanked back on the stick. The dive brakes screamed. His vision tunneled. He felt the GS crushing his chest. For a moment, he genuinely didn't know if the plane would hold together. The altimeter was still unwinding. The ocean was filling his windscreen. Then, with a groan of tortured metal, the Dauntless leveled out. He was 50 feet above the water. Behind him, his radio man was vomiting into his lap. McClusky didn't care. He craned his neck to look back. The bomb hit. And everything changed. The explosion wasn't large at first. Just a flash of white light near the Akagi's midsection. For a second, it looked like a miss. Then the secondary explosion started. The bomb had punched through the flight deck and detonated in the hangar below, right where the Japanese were rearming their aircraft. Fuel ignited. Torpedoes cooked off. Bombs exploded in chain reactions. Within 30 seconds, the Akagi was a floating inferno. McClusky's wingmen followed his lead. More bombs fell. The Kaga took 3 direct hits and began listing immediately. The Soryu was engulfed in flames within minutes. In the span of 4 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 elite aircraft carriers were destroyed. The battle wasn't over. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, would launch a counterattack and cripple the Yorktown. But the outcome was no longer in doubt. Japan had lost its offensive capability in the Pacific. The pilots who had terrorized Pearl Harbor were dead or swimming in burning oil. The carriers that had seemed invincible were sinking. And it had all hinged on one pilot's decision to ignore orders, follow a hunch, and dive at an angle that was supposed to be impossible. McClusky landed back on the Enterprise with fumes in his tanks. He had 17 gallons of fuel left. The minimum safety reserve was 50. He'd been flying on willpower for the last 20 minutes. When he climbed out of the cockpit, his hands were shaking, not from fear, but from exhaustion. His flight suit was soaked with sweat. His crew chief looked at the wings of the Dauntless and found stress fractures along the spars. The plane had been seconds away from structural failure. McClusky had pushed it past every limit. If the wings had snapped during the pullout, he would have cartwheeled into the ocean at 300 miles per hour. There would have been nothing left to recover. He didn't talk about it. That wasn't his style. But the other pilots talked. Within hours, every aviator in the fleet knew what McClusky had done. The mad dive. 75 degrees. Straight down. No hesitation. It violated every safety protocol. It ignored every training manual. But it worked. And more importantly, it was teachable. Within weeks, Navy dive bomber squadrons across the Pacific were practicing McClusky's technique. They called it the Midway dive. Steeper. Faster. Shorter time in the kill zone. Higher G-forces on pullout. More dangerous, but also more effective. The Japanese never recovered from Midway. Their carrier fleet was crippled. Their best pilots were dead. Their aura of invincibility was shattered. Historians would later call it the turning point of the Pacific War. But turning points don't happen in a vacuum. They happen because someone makes a choice. Someone ignores the rulebook. Someone looks at impossible and decides to try anyway. McClusky didn't think of himself as a hero. He thought of himself as a test pilot who happened to be in the right place at the right time. But that's not what history remembers. What history remembers is the moment he pushed that stick forward and committed to a dive that should have killed him. What history remembers is the 4 minutes that changed the war. What history remembers is that sometimes, the difference between victory and defeat isn't strategy, or numbers or technology. It's one person refusing to accept the limits everyone else believes in. After Midway, McClusky was awarded the Navy Cross. He flew combat missions for another year before being rotated stateside to train new pilots. He taught them everything, except the mad dive. That wasn't something you could teach in a classroom. It was something you had to decide for yourself, in the moment, when every instinct and every rule told you to pull out. Some pilots had it. Most didn't. The ones who did became legends. The ones who didn't still came home alive. Both outcomes were valuable. But only one changed history. The SBD Dauntless McClusky flew that day was repaired and put back into service. It flew dozens more missions before being retired in 1944. Today, it sits in a museum in Pensacola, Florida. The fuselage still has the stress fractures from that dive. Engineers have examined it multiple times, trying to understand how it didn't break apart. The math says it should have failed. The metal says it was on the edge. But it held. Just barely. Just long enough. McClusky's logbook from that day is also preserved. The entry for June 4, 1942, is remarkably brief. Located enemy carriers. Attacked. Hits observed. Returned to base. No mention of the dive angle. No mention of ignoring orders. No mention of nearly running out of fuel. Just the facts. Pilots like McClusky didn't write about feelings. They wrote about results. But the results spoke for themselves. Before Midway, Japan was winning the Pacific War. After Midway, they were on the defensive. The strategic initiative passed to the United States and never returned. Islands that Japan had held for decades would be retaken, one bloody battle at a time. The road to Tokyo had been opened, not by a grand strategy or a brilliant admiral, but by one pilot who looked at the rules and decided they didn't apply. Not today. Not when everything was on the line. Commanders had laughed at the idea of a 75-degree dive. Until they saw the results. Then they made it standard procedure. The mad dive became doctrine. By 1943, every Navy dive bomber pilot trained at the steeper angle. The technique was refined, optimized, incorporated into official training manuals. What had been a desperate improvisation became a calculated tactic. Pilots died learning it, just as McClusky had almost died executing it. But more pilots survived because of it. More bombs hit their targets. More enemy ships sank. The math was brutal but undeniable. The steeper dives saved lives. American lives. At the cost of Japanese ones. There's a tendency in history to sanitize moments like this. To make them clean. Heroic. Inspiring. But the truth is messier. McClusky's dive worked because he was willing to die. Not in some abstract, patriotic sense, but literally, in the next 60 seconds, if the wings snapped or the pullout failed. He made peace with that possibility before he pushed the stick forward. That's not heroism in the Hollywood sense. That's calculation. Cold. Rational. Brutal. He assessed the odds, decided the mission was worth the risk, and committed. The fact that he survived was almost secondary. The Japanese pilots at Midway were just as brave. Just as skilled. Many of them made similar calculations and paid with their lives. The difference wasn't courage or ability. The difference was that McClusky had one critical advantage. He knew his aircraft better than anyone else flying that day. He'd tested it. Pushed it. Broken it, and fixed it, and broken it again. He knew exactly how much stress the airframe could take before it failed. And he knew, not hoped, knew, that he could pull out of a 75-degree dive if he did it exactly right. That knowledge came from years of boring, repetitive, unglamorous test flights. Thousands of hours in the cockpit, not fighting enemies, but fighting physics. Learning where the edge was. Mapping it. Memorizing it. So that when the moment came, when the war demanded everything, he could go right to that edge and stop exactly 1 inch before falling off. That's what made the mad dive possible. Not bravery. Not luck. Preparation. The kind that no one sees because it happens in peacetime, when there are no cameras and no medals and no one cares. After the war, McClusky retired from the Navy and lived a quiet life. He didn't do the lecture circuit. Didn't write a memoir. Didn't capitalize on his fame. When journalists asked him about Midway, his answers were frustratingly brief. I did my job. We got lucky. The radio man deserves as much credit as I do. He deflected. Minimized. Refused to play the hero. It drove historians crazy. Here was the man who arguably won the most important naval battle of the 20th century, and he wouldn't talk about it. But maybe that's the point. Maybe the people who actually change history don't think of it that way. They think of it as Tuesday. Another mission. Another problem to solve. The significance comes later, when historians and filmmakers and textbook writers assign meaning to moments that, at the time, felt like chaos. McClusky didn't dive at 75 degrees because he wanted to be remembered. He did it because the carriers were there, and the angle was necessary, and the war wouldn't wait for him to consult a manual. In 1976, a reporter finally got McClusky to open up, just a little. Asked what went through his mind during the dive, McClusky paused for a long time. Then he said, I was thinking about the math. Wind speed, target speed, release altitude. If you think about dying, you'll miss. So I didn't think about it. The reporter pressed. But weren't you scared? McClusky smiled. Terrified. But fear is just data. It tells you you're doing something dangerous. It doesn't tell you to stop. That answer encapsulates everything. Fear is data. Not a command. Not a veto. Just information to be processed and filed away while you do the thing that needs doing. That mindset, treating emotion as input rather than directive, is what separates people who break barriers from people who respect them. It's not that McClusky wasn't afraid. It's that he didn't let fear make his decisions. He made his decisions, and then he dealt with the fear. The mad dive has been studied by military tacticians, aeronautical engineers, and psychologists. The consensus is that it shouldn't have worked. The G-forces on pullout were at the absolute limit of human tolerance. The structural stress on the airframe exceeded design specifications. The margin for error was zero. And yet it worked. Not once, but repeatedly, as other pilots adopted the technique. The only explanation is that McClusky had found a narrow corridor of possibility that everyone else assumed was closed. He didn't invent new physics. He just refused to accept the conventional wisdom about where the boundaries were. That's the lesson of Midway, if there is one. The boundaries are usually farther out than we think. Not infinitely far, physics still applies, and plenty of pilots died testing limits that turned out to be real. But farther. And the only way to find out where they really are is to push. Carefully. Methodically. With full awareness of the risks. McClusky didn't dive at 75 degrees on a whim. He'd spent years learning what his aircraft could do. When the moment came, he wasn't guessing. He was applying knowledge that nobody else had bothered to acquire. Today, the Battle of Midway is taught in every military academy in the world. The tactics. The strategy. The intelligence coup that let the US ambush the Japanese fleet. But the dive itself, the 4 minutes that actually decided the battle, gets less attention. Maybe because it's harder to teach. You can't train someone to ignore every instinct when everything is on the line. You can only hope they've done the preparation. And when the moment comes, that they push the stick forward anyway. McClusky died in 1976. His funeral was small. Quiet. A few fellow pilots. Some family. No presidents. No medal ceremony. Just the way he would have wanted it. But his legacy didn't die with him. Every carrier pilot who trains at Pensacola learns about the mad dive. Every tactical manual references Midway. Every time a pilot pushes past what's supposed to be possible, McClusky's ghost is in that cockpit. Because sometimes, history isn't written by the people who follow the rules. It's written by the ones who break them at exactly the right moment. Share this story, because forgotten heroes like Wade McClusky deserve to be remembered. Subscribe, because there are dozens more stories like this one, waiting to be told.